정성, 그리고 우리가 살고 있는 생태, 그리고 하나님을 더욱더 강력한 분이십니다.
So what you are doing here is not just for Korea, it's for the whole world. Every single battle we win is for the whole world.
여러분 안녕하세요. 오늘 2021년 2월 19일 금요일 오후 2시입니다. 저는 차바 행정 담당 운영위원 조영길 변호사입니다. 여러 가지로 바쁘실 텐데 이 차바를 이 금요일 오후에 이렇게 계속 시청해 주시는 전국의 성도 여러분, 국민 여러분 정말 머리 숙여서 감사를 드립니다. 지난 구정 연휴 잘 보내셨는지요? 저희는 구정 연휴가 금요일에 겹쳐서 차바는 결방했지만 지난주에는 화요일에 아주 긴박한 우리나라의 동성혼 합법화와 또 동성혼 차별금지에 관한 그런 법제이기를 여는 아주 위험한 법, 건강가정기본법을 저지시키기 위한 여러가지 활동 때문에 분주했습니다. 특별히 지난주 화요일 오전 10시에는 전문가들이 모여서 남인순 그리고 또 정춘숙 의원이 발의한 건강가정기본법의 위험한 실체를 국민들에게 알리는 긴급기자회견을 가졌는데 그 긴급기자회견을 저희 차바 채널을 통해서 송출해 드렸습니다. 그리고 구정을 전후해서 움직여서 이루어진 여러가지 좋은 소식은 제가 강의 이후에 광고 시간에 잠깐 설명드리겠습니다. 지난번에는 우리 김진섭 학장님 통해서 정말 신학적인 전문성을 가지고 신구약의 정통 복음적 신학의 관점에서 지금 동성애를 정당화하는 각종 세상의 이론과 이단적 신학에 대응하는 정확한 강의를 저희가 들을 수가 있었습니다. 오늘은 예고해드린 대로 가브리엘 쿠비의 강의가 준비되어 있습니다. 가브리엘 쿠비의 강사를 잠깐 여러분에게 소개해 올리겠습니다. 가브리엘 쿠비는 예고 동영상에도 온 것처럼 한국에 2017년에 방문을 해서 그때 생가효 국제대회 동성애를 반대하시는 또 성혁명 반대하는 국제적인 인사들을 모아서 저희들이 학술대회도 열고 또 시위도 행사도 가졌던 그때 이 가브리엘 쿠비가 국회에서 했던 그 강연의 영상 일부를 여러분께 보내드렸습니다. 저희가 이 가브리엘 쿠비를 초대한 이유는 가브리엘 쿠비가 지은 이 놀라운 저서 글로벌 성혁명의 라는 이 책의 저자이기 때문에 그렇습니다. 여러분에게 몇 차례 소개해 드렸지만 세계적으로 전개되고 있는 이 성혁명의 무서운 실체에 대해서 이론적 문제, 국제기구의 접수 문제, 국제인권기구의 장악 문제, 그리고 교육의 침투 문제, 각종 국가를 어떻게 변화시켜 나가서 기독교적인 가정윤리와 성윤리를 파괴하는 것인지에 대한 실체를 너무도 일목요연하게 잘 정리해준 책이 거의 제가 알기로는 이 가브리엘 쿠비 책이 가장 훌륭했습니다. 제가 이 책을 개인적으로 접한 것은 2016년 동성혼 소송을 준비하면서 지금 해외에 있는 반동성애 활동가들과 교제하면서 필요한 정보를 얻기 위해서 영국과 미국, 영국의 안드레아 윌리엄스, 미국의 ADF를 다녀올 때 이 글로벌 성혁명이라는 책을 좀 읽으면서 다녀왔습니다. 이 책의 내용이 너무 많은 통찰력과 우리가 박아야 할 길을 잘 알려주고 있어서 이 책을 우리나라의 국민들과 성도들에게 소개해드려야 되겠다라고 해서 번역 작업에 착수를 했고, 저희가 여러 출판사와 여러 번역자들을 찾아서 부탁했지만 굉장히 예민한 문제여서 많은 유수한 출판사들에서 거절을 하고 아주 능력 있는 저명한 번역가들도 다 거절을 해서 끝내 그래도 하나님을 위해서 고난과 불편도 감수하겠다라고 하는 우리 밝은 생각 출판사에서 또 출판을 해주시기로 했고, 또 정소형 미국 변호사가 번역을 감수해 주시기로 하셔서 번역 작업을 시작을 했고, 또 한국 성과학연구협회에서 감수해서 이 책이 지금 한국에 나온 지 몇 년이 됐습니다. 여러분, 이 책의 저자입니다. 그리고 개인적으로는 크게 박사학위는 없지만 석사학위의 주부시지만 무엇보다도 하나님 사랑하시고 이 부분에 관해서 정말 오랫동안 정확하게 연구해서 제가 보기에는 법률 분야도 굉장히 많은데 법률가인 제가 보기에도 전혀 굉장히 심오한 정확한 분석을 할 정도의 놀라운 통찰력을 가진 저자이고 또 책이기도 합니다. 여러분, 오늘 강의를 통해서 이 가브리엘 통해서 주시는 이 강의 제가 미리 들어봤는데요. 개인적으로는 안드레아 윌리엄스나 벤트렐라 교수님 강의보다도 더 우리에게 정말 큰 도움을 줄 유익한 강의다 이렇게 생각을 합니다. 여러분 꼭 처음부터 끝까지 시청해 주시고 많은 통찰력을 얻으시고 주위에도 많이 권면해 주시기를 부탁을 드립니다. 이 강의를 보면 전체주의적인 독재의 시대가 오고 있다라고 하는 이 말을 저희가 차별금지법 반대를 하면서 계속 차별금지법의 정체성을 드러내는 용어로 쓰고 있는데요. 이 전체주의적 독재라고 하는 말을 책에서 용어로 가장 제가 보기에는 먼저 써주신 분입니다. 그리고 진리의 구별과 정당한 차별이 어떻게 다른 것인지, 그리고 평등과 정의가 어떻게 조화롭게 되고 또 다른 개념이 있는 것인지, 그리고 인권 중에서 자연적 인권과 부자연적 인권이 얼마나 큰 차이를 만들어내는지, 요기야카르타 원칙이 얼마나 잘못된 원칙인지, 미래 세대가 어떻게 심각하게 오염되고 있고, 실제로 이 차별금지법을 통해서 성혁명의 액티비스트 활동가들이 얼마나 집요하게 진리를 선포하고 가르치는 성도들을 탄압하고 있는지에 대해서 짧은 50분이지만 굉장히 정확한 용어로 정말 성령 충만한 지혜를 저희에게 제공해주는 강의라고 생각합니다. 그리고 이 전쟁 승리하기 위해서 우리가 어떻게 해야 될지에 대한 기본 방향도 아주 목사님께서 이 번역을 시간을 내서 또 감수해 주시고 정확한 번역이 되도록 헌신을 해 주셨습니다. 감사를 드립니다. 여러분, 이제 가브리엘 쿠비의 강의를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 처음부터 끝까지 집중해서 들어주시고 많은 통찰력 얻으시는 저와 여러분 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 강의를 시작합니다.
Dear friends in South Korea, I'm speaking from Germany. We are very lucky to have these electronic means of communication in times of the corona pandemic. 3 years ago, I had the great privilege of visiting your country as a speaker of the conference Life, Family and Honor. It was a joyful event to meet all these people from many continents who fight for freedom, especially the freedom of the family, for the moral foundation of society and family, for the acknowledgement that there is a loving God above us to whom we are responsible. We are aware that our societies fall apart, that a new totalitarianism is arising, that the destruction of the family causes social chaos and immense suffering for millions and millions of people. We are in a war between the culture of death and the culture of life. It is a war between Marxist atheists who want to establish equality and of believers in God who want to establish justice. It is a war between those who will establish a totalitarian dictatorship by manipulation of mass consciousness, the jettison of law, and the use of violence, and those who work for the kingdom of God, and therefore fight for freedom and justice. They know that God, nature, and reason will win this war. At the core of our present situation is the deregulation of all moral restrictions of sexuality. The human being is the only creature endowed with free will. We are not bound by instinct as the animals are. So we need moral values, that is, the discrimination between good and bad, to make decisions how we use our freedom. The sexual norms belong to the operating system of a society because they have enormous impact on the whole cultural edifice of a society. Therefore, every society fiercely protects sexual norms with social and legal penalties. Until the student revolution of 1968, monogamy was the standard of the once Christian culture. One man and one woman bonding in marriage to give life to children and bring them up in the shelter of belonging to their parents. Now, sexual morality has been turned upside down. It's the permissiveness of sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and even the choice of one's sex that the law is forcing through under the deceptive banner of non-discrimination and equality. Western societies have gone down this road into the destruction of the basis of family and society with an incredible speed, and there's no end to it. Asian countries were slower in overturning the fundamental value system. But the sexual revolution is indeed global. It is the agenda of the United Nations, the European Union, and other supranational organizations. It is infiltrating every nation and every society. Revolutions usually are an answer to the demands of suppressed and suffering people. But where are the masses who demand same-sex marriage, the freedom to change your sex at will, or the dissolution of parenthood by artificial reproduction? They do not exist. The sexual revolution is a top-down revolution brought about by the elites of power and money, who use small and smallest sexual minorities to wage war on the traditions that once supported the family of father, mother, and children. Now, In your country, once more, the Liberal Justice Party of South Korea is making a new attempt to ban, quote, all kinds of discrimination based on gender, disability, age, language, country of origin, sexual orientation, physical condition, academic background, and any other reason, end of quote. Justice Party Representative Yang Hae-young said in a press conference, quote, a law banning comprehensive discrimination will be a means to keep our dignity and safety. There are people who are discriminated against without reason in political, economic, social, and cultural life. Discrimination leads to hate and violence that denies human dignity. Nobody deserves to be discriminated against because they are weak or a social minority. End of quote. The degree of unclarity and confusion in this justification for the proposed bill is amazing. It is like a cloud of fog that hides the true intention of the law. The characteristics of sex, age, physical condition, sexual orientation, cultural background, and academic background make up the identity of a person. To recognize the difference between people has nothing to do with discrimination. Discrimination means that someone incurs disadvantages in political, economic, social, and cultural life because of these differences. The opposite is true. In order not to discriminate, we must take these differences into account. Only this way justice can be established. The denial of the difference, the false claim of equality, in reality is a denial of human dignity, and that leads to hate and violence. A human society cannot achieve justice by the futile attempt to eradicate all differences. Do we want women to fight with a weapon at the front line of a war? Do we want that 2 men or 2 women can marry and produce children by buying the missing genetic material? Do we want that women can grow a beard by taking hormones, give birth to a child, and say that they are the father? Do we want men to compete with women in sports? Let us go back to the word and the meaning of discrimination. The Latin word discrimen means distinction or difference. The person endowed with free will must distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, to handle this freedom in such a way as to succeed in his own life and not to bring harm to his fellow human beings. For the person who knows that he is answerable to God, this distinction between good and evil is essential for his eternal salvation. If he is forbidden by law to make this distinction, then religious freedom in reality is banned. Parents, teachers, and pastors will not be allowed to pass on Christian values to the next generation. There's a great misunderstanding on the side of the cultural revolutionists. To distinguish between good and evil is not to discriminate against people. Every person, regardless of his sexual orientation or any other personal traits, is equal in dignity, and every person enjoys legal protection against libel, harassment, and exclusion. For Christians, the principle is to hate sin and to love the sinner. Whereas for atheists, cultural revolutionists, there is no sin because there is no God, and anybody who holds on to moral standards is hated and silenced and threatened in his social and material existence. Anti-discrimination or equality legislation is a means to achieve this by law. In recent years, almost all Western nations have adopted so-called equality laws. They are an instrument to silence Christians who are not willing to compromise their faith. Let me give you a few examples of legal cases. There are now thousands of cases where equality laws are used to silence especially Christians. Consider the case of Peter and Hazel Mary Bull, an elderly Christian couple who operated a small bed and breakfast guest house in south of England. True to their faith, they only rented their rooms to heterosexual married couples. This hadn't caused any problems for about 20 years, but in 2008, after the adoption of equality legislation in the United Kingdom, they received a letter from an organization called Stonewall, the UK's leading LGBT organization, whose slogan is "Acceptance without exception." The Bulls were warned that they were breaking the law. The following month, a same-sex couple turned up at their doorstep and demanded a double room. The Bulls declined, explaining their long-standing policy. This time, the police were called, and their property was called, and the Bulls were sued. They received hate mails and death threats, and their property was vandalized. After being dragged through the courts for 5 years, the guesthouse business was ultimately destroyed. Or the case of Jack Phillips, owner of the Masterpiece Cake Shop in the United States, Colorado. In 2012, two men asked Jack Phillips to create a wedding cake celebrating their same-sex marriage. Jack politely declined because of religious beliefs about marriage. The Colorado Civil Rights Commission judged that Jack had violated anti-discrimination law. The case went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. The court found that the government was wrong to punish Jack for peacefully living out his beliefs in the marketplace. Jack hoped that after 4 years of legal struggle, he would now again be able to lead a normal and peaceful life. But he underestimated the relentlessness of the LGBTIQ lobby. A transgender woman turned up and asked him to decorate a cake for her gender transition. Another lawsuit followed. The obvious intention of such acts is to threaten anybody with the ruin of his existence if he dares to resist this agenda. Jack Phillips could only take this path of legal resistance because the organization Alliance Defending Freedom took on his case. If you go to their website, you will find many cases where the new equality laws are being used to curtail freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, the right of parents to educate their own children according to their values. Should you yourself incur persecution in your own country, you can apply for help to Alliance Defending Freedom International. There's a fundamental contradiction between anti-discrimination and the freedom of religion. Democratic freedoms as they are codified 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are founded on the Christian concept of man and his inviolable dignity. These true human rights are only respected in reality if a society is still predominantly Christian. If Christian faith never was the foundation of society, or if it is fading, as it now does in Western countries, human rights are undermined, redefined, and replaced by laws that establish a new atheistic and hedonistic ideology. Hedonistic means do whatever increases your pleasure. Christians believe that God has created man as man and woman and called them to procreate within the bond of marriage. This is the message of the Bible from beginning to end. Jesus leaves no doubt that marriage is a sacred bond that cannot be broken. Christians keep the commandments of God because they love God and because they know and believe that this is a condition of receiving the grace of eternal salvation. So they cannot comply with the new laws that enforce the total acceptance of hedonistic sexuality. Christians do not force their morality on others, but they must be able to proclaim their faith, act in accordance with it, and educate their children accordingly. That is the content of the human right of freedom of religion, which is essential to democracy. The atheist revolutionaries want to suppress the biblical message. For them, it is discrimination, even though they have all the rights to live their lifestyle as they want. That is why pastors have been heavily fined and even imprisoned if they quote from the Bible, or why students were excluded from university, or why employees are dismissed from their job if they hold on to the biblical message. The human right of freedom of religion and anti-discrimination laws implant an obvious contradiction into law. In most cases, the freedom of religion loses the battle. To somehow mediate between the human right of freedom of religion and equality laws, legislators have tried to balance the competing interests by providing exemptions for religious organizations. But if we accept the idea that religious freedom is discriminatory and can only be permitted under an exemption, the public's attitude towards the once sacrosanct freedom will forever be changed. On top of it, exemptions are always vulnerable to future narrowing. There will never be enough to satisfy those who think religious believers are discriminating and getting away with it, says Paul Coleman from Alliance Defending Freedom. Whatever cultural revolutionists achieve, it is never enough. One example. First, they demand civil partnership for homosexuals, then same-sex marriage, then adoption, then artificial production of a child by buying what they don't have, the genetic material of the other sex, and renting the womb of a woman. They push for acceptance in Christian churches by demanding blessings and Christian rights for a marriage between same-sex people that is not a marriage. It is not enough to succeed in having all these unnatural human rights granted by law, but any voice must be silenced who stands up for another concept of man and for the rights of the child. This is because man is created with an inner compass for moral truth, which we call conscience. The voice of conscience can be muted by an immoral behavior. But if the compass of truth is awakened in a person that has chosen this kind of lifestyle, it causes pain, and this pain may be turned into hatred. Of course, the ultimate victory of any revolution is the transformation of the human being according to their ideology. That is why all revolutionaries set in motion, as soon as they have the power to do so, to transform the children. At the core of the present revolution is to overthrow any moral limitations of sexuality. Children must be sexualized from the cradle all the way through kindergarten and school. It is the agenda of the United Nations, the European Union, and national governments of the West. To give you just one example, the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, published by UNESCO, UNICEF, UNAIDS, UN Women, and the World Health Organization. International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. I remember the shock of people in South Korea and Taiwan when I showed them material for sex education in German textbooks. They couldn't believe that kindergarten children were encouraged to naked doctor plays and masturbation. Asian countries obviously have not proceeded that far with the sexualization of children by force of state, as Western nations have. Teach your children to masturbate from babyhood onwards. Teach them to accept homosexual and transgender lifestyles. Change the concept of family by introducing rainbow families in picture books. Destabilize their sexual identity as boy and girl. Train them to be experts of contraception before puberty. Make abortion an easy way out. Give them puberty-delaying hormones if they so wish, even though it will ruin their life. Numerous times, parents appealed to the European Court of Human Rights to be allowed to withdraw their children from this kind of indoctrination, but without success. Their cases were not even accepted. The reason is that the European Court of Human Rights has itself been converted into an agency of the destruction of the Christian foundation of Western democracies. An analysis of the European Centre of Law and Justice from 2020 found that 20% of the judges of the court were former members of George Soros NGOs. That means they're not independent and impartial judges, but activists in the robe of a judge. It seems the same strategies were applied also to the Constitutional Court in Germany. In the name of non-discrimination, the court ruled in 2018 that a third gender must be introduced called diverse. Now, if you have some rare physical abnormality called intersexuality, or if you can't make up your mind whether you are a man or a woman, you can opt for diverse in your identity documents. When an employer advertises open jobs, he has to search for male, female, diverse employees. Anything else would be a discrimination and would be fined heavily. The reasoning of the Supreme Court was that people with biological abnormalities of their sexual organs were discriminated if they had to register either as man or woman. There are only very few people who have biological abnormalities of their sexual organs, but there are 99.99% of the population who will be confused. The strategies of the cultural revolutionists are highly sophisticated, organized, and long-term. They make use of all methods of social engineering, especially the media and entertainment industry. They reach for the highest levels of power in governments and international organizations, the legal system, and academia. They infiltrate the church, the last bulwark of resistance. They adapt their strategies to the specific conditions of any nation, culture, and religion. The ideological breakthrough was the formulation of gender ideology by the US-American philosopher Judith Butler in a book she published in 1990 with the title gender trouble, feminism, and the subversion of identity. This is what she is after, and puts plainly into the title, the subversion of identity of man and woman. She claims that our biological sex can be changed at will into the social sex a person fancies. In several nations, this has now found entry into law. You can choose your sex at will without the need of any transition measures. So in the passport, a man can be registered as a woman as a man, and both as diverse, something undefined in between. Transgender activist Ricky Wilchens expresses in a nutshell what the battle is about. Make the binary burn. Ending our culture's obsession with what is male and what is female will be our salvation. So says Ricky Wilchens. A document called the Yogyakarta Principles maps out the LGBTIQ agenda in detail. A group of so-called renowned experts of human rights with no official authorization formulated these 29 principles and were allowed to present them in the Palais des Nations of the United Nations in Geneva to give them a glow of authority. 10 years later, the Yogyakarta plus 10 principles were added, quote, additional principles and state obligations on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics to complement the Yogyakarta principles. All these are new invented expressions which you just heard: sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, which have the purpose to change the value system on which our societies are founded. Many governments have endorsed these principles and committed themselves to their implementation. The judicial key to the enforcement of these principles is the introduction of sexual identity into anti-discrimination legislation. The principles demand that all countries of the world take measures to change their constitutions, laws, social institutions, police, military, healthcare, education, and their citizens' basic attitudes in order to enforce and legally compel acceptance and privileged status for homosexuality and any other non-heterosexual identities and behaviors. The text of the Yogyakarta Principles clearly exhibits the goals, the methods of obfuscation, and the enforcement methods for the global implementation of LGBTIQ agenda. The methods of implementation are hollowing out national sovereignty through UN treaty monitoring bodies in cooperation with the local NGOs, non-government organizations. Supplying financial resources in the millions from the United Nations, the European Union, and individual states for these lobby organizations. Enact court cases at all levels of the legal system in the name of human rights and anti-discrimination. Change the population's fundamental values by public demonstrations, the Christopher Street Days, portraying the homosexual and transgender lifestyle as normal and attractive in the media and the entertainment industry. Social and legal sanctions against opposition, threatening their material existence. The change of language is essential for brainwashing people without them even noticing, by inventing new concepts like gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, sexual expression, homophobia, diversity, and by abusing the noble concept of human rights and anti-discrimination. The Yogyakarta principles are furnished with an activist guide to the Yogyakarta principles. It is a toolbox for the lobby organizations for changing the values and legal basis of sovereign states. Central to this is the language of human rights, which demands rights without any duties. The toolbox contains strategic instructions adaptable to all cultural conditions and links local activists to the World Wide Web of the cultural revolutionists on the highest levels of power and money. In every country, there's a small minority of homosexual and transgender people to whom now prospects of life are offered. They are supplied with money, education, jobs, and juridical support so they can set to work in their own culture. I've dedicated one whole chapter to the Yogyakarta principles because I think it is good to know the plan behind the changes we see happening. You can pick off for every nation what has already been achieved. The question is, how did we get there? How did we arrive in a madhouse where reality is denied and fantasy reigns? It has to do with a fundamental change in the concept of human rights. And that has to do with a total reversal in the concept of man. Is there a God who created man and who endowed him with objective morality through revelation and the voice of conscience in his heart? Or is man his own God? I owe the following